The year is 1066. The battlefields of Hastings are silent, littered with the corpses of fallen Anglo-Saxon warriors. But the true war has only just begun. It is not fought with swords, but with vows, whispers, and flesh. For in the wake of the Norman conquest, the fate of England's noblewomen was sealed not in chronicles of victory, but in chambers locked away from public sight. Imagine being a high-born lady of Saxon blood, your husband dead, your estate seized, your children's inheritance erased with the stroke of a quill. And then comes the knock at the door. A Norman knight, chosen not by your consent but by your conqueror's decree, stands waiting. In that moment, your body, your lineage, even your womb, is no longer yours. You are a pawn in the ruthless chess game of conquest. Whispers of droit du seigneur, the so-called lord's right of the first knight, echo across Europe. Whether legend or fact, the very idea speaks volumes of women's vulnerability. For Norman lords, desire and domination went hand in hand. Taking the daughter or widow of a fallen rival was not simply lust, it was the final humiliation of a conquered people. In the darkest corners of castles, behind the piety of the new church reforms, women were used as instruments of submission. To the medieval mind, nothing was more taboo than speaking of what happened in those nights. Chroniclers were quick to record the deeds of kings and the distribution of land, but they remained silent on the intimate price women paid for survival. And yet, if we read between the lines, if we trace the sudden disappearances of noble names, if we study the marriages arranged in haste, the outlines of the truth begin to emerge. This was a time when conquest was not merely about crowns and castles, it was about bloodlines. The Norman elite knew that to secure their rule, they had to control not just land, but the wombs that would bear the next generation. Anglo-Saxon heiresses were married off to Norman knights. Widowed queens were forced into submission. Daughters were bartered like coin. The politics of domination were written into the most intimate corners of daily life. And yet, the church preached chastity, purity, and obedience. The contradiction is staggering. The very institution that sanctified marriage also turned a blind eye when that same institution became a tool of conquest. These hypocrisies festered in silence, creating a world where noble women were both exalted as vessels of lineage and degraded as spoils of war. But here lies the question that history dares not ask. What became of these women when the annals of kings fell silent? What secret rituals, humiliations, and bargains unfolded in the shadow of Norman triumph? Their fate was not carved into stone, but it lingers in the bones beneath abbey floors, in forgotten charters, and in legends whispered by the oppressed. The chronicles may never tell us everything, but tonight we will peel back the veil. We will walk into the forbidden chambers, uncover the scandals silenced by scribes, and bring into the light the unspoken fate of noble women after the Norman conquest. And what we find will shock even the darkest corners of medieval history. Conquest does not end with the battlefield, it seeps into the bedchamber. For the Normans, controlling England meant more than castles and taxes. It meant mastery over the most intimate aspects of life. Sexuality was a weapon, a language of dominance, and for noble women, it became the battlefield they could not escape. In Norman England, marriage was never about love. It was about land, blood, and obedience. Anglo-Saxon heiresses, the last hope of their fallen dynasties, were forced into unions with Norman knights. These marriages were not invitations, they were orders. Imagine a young widow, her Saxon husband slain in Hastings, her estate seized. Within weeks she is remarried, this time to a man who speaks a foreign tongue and worships a foreign ambition. Consent was a formality, refusal was not an option. But marriage was only one face of conquest. Behind closed doors, concubinage thrived. Noble women who resisted were often taken as unofficial partners, their bodies claimed without the sanctity of vows. In Norman chronicles, these women appear only as shadows, unnamed ladies of the court, their existence reduced to whispers, yet their influence was undeniable. A well-placed mistress could determine alliances, betray secrets, or birth illegitimate heirs who quietly shaped dynasties. Here lies the psychology of power, control through intimacy. To break a conquered people, you did not merely kill their warriors, you took their daughters. To erase a bloodline, you did not burn their castles. You filled their wombs with foreign heirs. The act of possession was both personal and political, turning the female body into the ultimate symbol of conquest. Even more disturbing, was the hypocrisy of the church. Priests preached purity from the pulpit, yet in private, many kept concubines. The very men tasked with sanctifying marriage profited from the exploitation of women. Sexuality became a tool not just of lords and kings, but of bishops and abbots. When women were forced into cloisters to remove them from political intrigue, many found themselves subject to the same exploitation behind monastery walls. Sanctity and sin blurred in ways that few dared to document. And yet, in this darkness, some women adapted. A noblewoman who learned to wield her desirability could survive where resistance meant destruction. Some Saxon widows, forced into Norman marriages, turned their position into influence, whispering in their new husband's ears, shaping decisions in secret. Desire could be a prison, but it could also be a weapon. Still, the cost was staggering. The vast majority had no voice, no choice, and no control. Their bodies became silent contracts, written in flesh and blood, binding conqueror and conquered together in the most intimate of bargains. But what happens when desire turns into scandal? When the hidden affairs of conquerors spill into the realm of politics? When a noblewoman's fate is no longer confined to the chamber, but explodes into the court for all to see? That revelation is where our story turns next. Every conquest has its martyrs, and every conquest has its scandals. In the shadows of 1066, one woman's fate became a legend of silence: Edith Swan Neck. She was not just Harold Godwinson's consort, she was his true partner, his confidant, and, in many ways, his queen. Yet when Harold fell at Hastings, Edith's life was erased as quickly as his crown. Chroniclers record her only in whispers. Some say she was forced into obscurity, sent to a convent where her noble bloodline would wither away. Others believe she was claimed by Norman hands, her role transformed from consort of a king to trophy of a conqueror. Her name lingers like a ghost, a symbol of how quickly noble women could vanish when power shifted. Edith's story was not unique. Across England, Saxon noblewomen found themselves stripped of lands, titles, and autonomy. Norman knights were granted not only estates, but the widows who came with them. Imagine the humiliation. A lady of the Saxon aristocracy, whose halls once hosted kings, suddenly ordered to wed the very man who butchered her kin. For the conqueror, it was not enough to seize her land. He had to own her body as well. One chronicled scandal rippled through William's own court. It was whispered that Norman commanders, during the harrying of the north, did not merely slaughter the resisting Saxons, they took their women, noble and common alike. Villages burned, but in the ashes lay another kind of conquest, one seldom written but always remembered in oral tradition. Priests muttered of unimaginable cruelties, but the church dared not record specifics. Silence was safer, and yet, even within the court itself, sexual scandal festered. Mistresses became political currency. William's nobles passed women between them as rewards for loyalty, creating webs of betrayal and jealousy. Behind the iron facade of Norman order, lust and humiliation undermined trust. One whispered affair between a Norman lord and the widow of a Saxon earl nearly sparked rebellion when land grants were disputed. To the men who ruled, women's bodies were both symbols of status and weapons of treachery. The human cost was staggering. A woman forced into concubinage could bear children with no claim to inheritance, their very existence a scandal, yet a danger to dynasties. Others, married by decree, bore heirs whose legitimacy papered over conquest with the gloss of union. But beneath the surface, these were unions of fear, not love. Contracts of survival signed in silence. And yet, the chronicles barely mention these women. Why? Because their stories undermined the grandeur of Norman triumph. To admit the scandals was to admit that conquest was not only political, but sexual. That England was not merely taken by sword, but by bed. But even silence has cracks. Through charters, rumours, and the sudden disappearance of noble names, we glimpse the truth. Scandal was the heartbeat of conquest. And when scandal becomes too powerful to contain, it does not remain hidden. It shapes politics, alliances, and betrayals. And so we ask, what happens when seduction and scandal do not just haunt the private chamber, but decide the fate of kingdoms? For in Norman England, seduction and betrayal were not whispers in the dark. They were the very currency of politics. Behind every castle wall, power was not only negotiated with treaties or armies, but with bodies. Noblewomen, whether willingly or under duress, found themselves at the center of intrigues that determined inheritance, alliances, and even the fate of rebellions. Consider the forced marriages of Saxon heiresses. To the Normans, these unions were legal strategies, designed to cement land and loyalty. Yet to the women involved, every kiss, every child carried political weight. A single heir could unify a conquered estate under Norman control. A whispered rumor of infidelity could unravel an alliance and plunge counties into civil strife. And not all intrigue belonged to the conquerors. Some women turned seduction into survival. A widow coerced into Norman marriage could play her new husband against his rivals, feeding information in exchange for protection. In a world where written records erase their names, these women carved influence through the only weapon left to them, their bodies and their silence. But silence was fragile. When a mistress whispered too loudly, when jealousy seeped into the court, scandals exploded into politics. William's barons, already restless over land grants, often quarreled over women. An affair between a Norman lord and a Saxon widow could lead to whispers of betrayal, accusations of treason, or worse, a rebellion disguised as a matter of honor. Sexual scandal was not just gossip, it was political dynamite. The church, meanwhile, played its own double game. Officially, priests condemned adultery and concubinage, yet many bishops kept women quietly in their households. Some abbots arranged marriages of convenience for noble women whose estates they coveted. Hiding political maneuvering behind religious law, the church was both moral judge and silent participant, tightening its grip on England by deciding which unions were legitimate and which were damned. Religion, sex, and politics collided in spectacular hypocrisy. While priests thundered from pulpits about the sanctity of marriage, kings and barons arranged secret liaisons to secure loyalty. Women were caught in this hypocrisy, exalted as symbols of piety when obedient, condemned as temptresses when rebellious. A noble woman could be sainted or slandered, depending on whose power her body served. And yet, some women embraced this dangerous game. A mistress with the ear of a baron could influence battles. A secret affair could shift alliances. One misplaced desire could topple a dynasty. The conquest had turned every noblewoman into a potential spy, seductress, or scapegoat. But power gained through scandal was fragile. The same whispers that elevated a woman could also destroy her. Jealous rivals spread rumors, husbands turned suspicious, kings grew wary of disloyalty born in the bedchamber. In the ruthless court of the Normans, women who played the game risked everything. And as we shall see next, when these excesses spiraled out of control, the consequences would burn not only individuals, but entire kingdoms. While scandals at court shook kingdoms, the impact of Norman conquest reached into every corner of daily life. For noblewomen and commoners alike, intimacy, marriage, and survival were rewritten under Norman rule. Marriage itself became a battlefield. Among the nobility, daughters as young as 12 were wed to Norman knights, not for affection, but for the consolidation of estates. A Saxon heiress could find herself delivered like a parcel, her hand granted by decree of the king. In this world, a wedding was less a celebration and more a public declaration that another bloodline had been conquered. For common women, the lines between survival and exploitation were thinner still. The manorial system gave lords near total power over their tenants. If a peasant woman refused the advances of a Norman master, she risked punishment not just for herself, but for her family. Sexual servitude was unspoken but omnipresent, woven into the fabric of feudal life. A woman's silence became a shield, her endurance a daily form of resistance. The hypocrisy was stark. Norman men flaunted mistresses with impunity, while noblewomen accused of adultery could be cast aside, confined to convents, or even executed. A man's scandal could be spun into political intrigue. A woman's scandal became a death sentence. Gender was not just a role, it was a trap. And yet, culture found ways to absorb these contradictions. Songs and tales hinted at forbidden liaisons, cloaking dark truths in allegory. In monastic chronicles, women appeared as symbols, temptresses, saints, martyrs, but rarely as people. The common folk whispered tales of Norman cruelty, of women taken by force, of brides stolen on their wedding nights. What the scribes censored, the people preserved in rumor. For women of status, life became a tightrope. They were expected to embody piety and chastity, yet simultaneously bear heirs to men they had not chosen. They were cloistered in abbeys for protection, yet even there exploitation lurked. Behind monastery walls, power often mirrored the same abuses outside. Sanctity offered no true escape. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this hidden world. The graves of highborn women show sudden shifts in burial practices, Saxon traditions replaced by Norman ones, signifying not just cultural erasure, but forced assimilation. Charters document women stripped of estates overnight, their signatures replaced by those of Norman husbands. Even jewelry unearthed from ruins carries silent testimony. Saxon brooches buried beneath Norman designs, symbols of a culture overwritten. But perhaps the darkest reality was childbirth. Women married young, often against their will, and faced repeated pregnancies with little care. Mortality rates soared. Each childbirth was not only a personal risk, but a political act, the creation of heirs that secured Norman control. To the conquerors, the deaths of women in childbed were collateral. To the women, they were silent sacrifices that went unrecorded. This was the double life of conquest, public displays of piety, private realities of domination. For the conquerors, control over women was both practical and symbolic. For the conquered, survival meant silence, endurance, and, in rare cases, the careful use of desire as leverage. But silence could not last forever. When abuses piled too high, when famine and fire swept across the land, even the conquered began to resist. And in that crucible of suffering, a turning point arrived, one that revealed the cost of unchecked desire and taboo power. Every age of excess eventually reaches its breaking point. For Norman England, that breaking point came in fire and famine, the harrying of the North. In the winter of 1069-70, William the Conqueror unleashed his fury on the rebellious north of England. Villages were burned, fields salted, livestock slaughtered. The chronicles speak of corpses rotting in the streets, famine so deep that people ate cats, dogs, even human flesh. Yet buried within these horrors lies a truth too disturbing for most scribes to record: the fate of the women. Norman soldiers did not merely kill, they humiliated. Noble women who once commanded respect in Saxon courts were stripped of dignity, forced into marriages or taken as concubines. Even the chroniclers, often cautious with their words, whispered of unspeakable cruelties visited upon the wives and daughters of the fallen. For every man slain, a woman endured a quieter, more lingering defeat. This was the moment when conquest turned from domination to annihilation. For noble women, there was no longer hope of negotiation, no survival through marriage alone. Many were thrust into abbeys, their wealth absorbed by Norman monasteries. To the outside world, it was an act of piety. In reality, it was imprisonment by another name. Others fared far worse. Oral traditions, songs, folk tales, half-remembered laments hint at women taken during the harrying, vanishing into the households of Norman knights, never to be seen again. Entire family lines dissolved, erased not only by fire and famine, but by forced assimilation of their women into the conqueror's bloodlines. The turning point was not just brutality, it was the realization that silence was no longer enough. Some women resisted. Chronicles tell of abbesses who defied Norman lords, hiding fugitives within convent walls. Others turned to poison, betrayal, or whispered rebellion, using what little power they had to strike back. These acts were rare, often ending in death, but they reveal a shift. Women were no longer simply victims, they were potential saboteurs. Even the church could not ignore the scandal forever. The scale of forced marriages and coerced unions forced ecclesiastical councils to address the problem. Decrees were issued insisting on consent in marriage, a concept that, while rarely honored, signaled that the church recognized the abuses were too widespread to conceal. Behind this legal language was a deeper truth. Sexual excess and unchecked taboo practices had begun to undermine Norman authority itself. For William, the harrying achieved its goal. Rebellion was crushed, and his dominance secured. But at what cost? The land was devastated for a generation, and the moral stain of his campaign haunted even sympathetic chroniclers. When Norman power pushed too far, it revealed a truth conquerors feared. A throne can be seized with swords, but it can be poisoned by scandal. The suffering of noble women in this crucible of fire and famine marked a turning point. The fate of women after the Norman conquest was not confined to their lifetimes. It rippled outward, reshaping kingdoms, cultures, and even the laws that governed Europe. What began as private scandal and silent suffering grew into a legacy that altered the course of history. The first consequence was dynastic transformation. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was systematically erased not only through battle, but through blood. Forced marriages between Saxon heiresses and Norman knights rewrote the map of power. Within a single generation, once great Saxon houses were absorbed into Norman bloodlines. The conquerors had used the womb as effectively as the sword, ensuring that future heirs bore the names and loyalties of Normandy rather than England. What chronicles celebrated as unification was, in truth, assimilation through coerced intimacy. The second consequence was cultural silence. Women's names vanished from records during this era at alarming rates. Charters list land transferred through the marriage of such and such, but the women themselves are reduced to footnotes, if mentioned at all. This erasure was deliberate. To record the forced unions honestly would have revealed the brutality beneath Norman triumph. The absence of women's voices in chronicles is itself the echo of their suffering. Yet silence left traces. Church law began to shift in response to abuses too widespread to ignore. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, ecclesiastical councils declared that marriage required consent, a radical idea for the time. While rarely enforced in practice, the very need for such a decree reveals the scale of coerced unions in Norman England. What the conquerors tried to hide had become impossible to ignore. The third consequence was rebellion of memory. Folk tales, oral traditions, and even later ballads preserve whispers of women wronged during the conquest. In these stories, noble women become tragic heroines, forced brides, imprisoned widows, or vengeful spirits haunting the halls of Norman castles. Though dismissed as superstition, these tales preserve truths censored by scribes. In the silence of the chronicles, the people found other ways to remember. And then there is the long shadow of taboo. The idea of women as spoils of war, of forced unions as instruments of politics, did not die with 1066. It echoed through the Crusades, when noble women were traded in foreign courts. It echoed in the Plantagenet era, when political marriages silenced dynasties. It echoed in the colonial expansions centuries later, when conquest once again meant domination of land and bodies alike. Archaeology now provides the evidence chroniclers suppressed. Mass graves from the harrying of the North show famine's toll on women and children. DNA evidence reveals sudden shifts in bloodlines, markers of Norman assimilation. The bones tell the truth that parchment dared not. In the end, the fate of these women shaped more than families. It shaped empires. Their forced unions built the very foundation of Norman England. Their silences forced laws to evolve. Their suffering lives on not in the words of scribes, but in the shadows of culture, the whispers of memory, and the bloodlines of rulers who followed. But what does this mean for us today? How do the unspoken fates of women after conquest echo into our modern world? And what secrets still lie buried in the chronicles of silence? That is where our journey ends, by confronting the relevance of these forbidden truths in our own age. We began with the silence of the chronicles, and we end with the silence of graves. The Norman conquest is remembered in textbooks as a story of kings and castles, of William's triumph at Hastings and the reshaping of England. But hidden beneath that triumph lies the unspoken fate of women, noble and common alike, whose lives were rewritten by conquest, not in ink, but in blood. Their marriages became contracts of submission. Their bodies became instruments of assimilation. Their names, their voices were systematically erased. And yet, without them, Norman power could never have taken root. The conquerors secured England not only with swords, but with forced unions, whispered scandals, and the silent endurance of women whose stories were too taboo to record. Why does this matter now? Because the patterns of the past echo through our present. Even in modern warfare, sexual violence remains a weapon. Even in modern politics, scandals hidden in bedrooms shape the destinies of nations. What happened to noble women after 1066 is not an isolated story. It is part of a darker truth of human history. Conquest has always sought to dominate both land and flesh. The Church's response offers another haunting parallel. Councils began insisting on consent in marriage, not out of enlightened morality, but because abuses had become too destructive to ignore. It took catastrophe, famine, and scandal to force a shift. How often do we, even now, wait until abuses become impossible to deny before acknowledging them? The hypocrisy of medieval bishops is uncomfortably familiar. And then there is the silence. The chronicles erase these women. Their suffering was deemed unworthy of record, How many of today's silences, forgotten voices, erased testimonies, hidden scandals, will future generations look back on with the same unease? History does not simply reveal the past, it warns us about the present. So we end with a question, one meant not just for historians, but for all of us. What other secrets lie buried in the chronicles we trust? If conquest can erase the fates of queens and noble daughters, how many other stories of suffering, of survival, of resilience remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered? The Norman conquest reshaped a kingdom, but its darkest legacy was not in castles built or laws imposed. It was in the quiet rooms where noble women faced choices no chronicles dared describe: submit, resist, or disappear. Their silence echoes still, a reminder that history's loudest victories are built on its quietest tragedies. And so, when we tell the story of conquest, let us never forget the ones who had no voice. For in their silence lies the darkest truth of all. Would you have survived by submission, or risked everything by resistance? What silences in today's world will tomorrow's historians uncover? Call to action. If you want more forbidden truths of history, join us as we unearth what others dare to forget.